Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Zoom panel that is a production of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of Democracy Journal, and I want to thank you all for joining us this morning to talk about immigration. This Zoom panel is based on the lead symposium in our most recent issue, which we called Humane Immigration Reform Now. And it had 7 articles, and we have 4 of those authors with us today. And so we're going to hear from them, and we have a terrific moderator, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. Immigration is bouncing around in the news a bit right now because of what's going on Capitol Hill and certain efforts to include some kind of immigration measure in the reconciliation bill. Perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that. But certainly we want our writers here to talk about their articles and to talk about the broader prospects and broader context for immigration reform in the United States. Let me introduce our panelists and then we'll get started. Todd Schultz is president of Forward US, that's rendered FWD.US. It's a bipartisan political and policy advocacy organization focused on fixing our broken immigration and criminal justice systems. On immigration policy, Todd has overseen work on criminal justice and immigration reform, pushes around comprehensive reform, dreamer legislation, Supreme Court fights, and other matters. Dr. Doug Holtz-Eakin is currently president of the American Action Forum, a center-right policy think tank in Washington, D.C. Previously, he had served as director of domestic and economic policy for the John McCain presidential campaign in 2008. He was the 6th director also of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and the chief economist of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Silva Mathema is the associate director for policy on the immigration policy team at the Center for American Progress. She has a PhD in public policy from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and her recent research is focused on topics from temporary protected status to refugee policies. And not here yet, but joining us as soon as she can in about half an hour will be Claudia Flores. I'll go ahead and introduce her now anyway. Claudia is the Associate Director for Immigration Policy and Strategy at the Center for American Progress, and she's written extensively on immigrant contributions and the positive impacts of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. That, of course, is the DACA program. Carlos Curbelo, the former Republican congressman who also wrote for the package and who was originally scheduled to be part of this conversation, unfortunately could not join us. He had to travel at the last minute. We want to thank Claudia for filling in a pinch. That's our panel. It's a terrific panel. They're all going to talk a little bit about the pieces they wrote, and the conversation will be ably steered by Nicole Narea, who is an immigration reporter for Vox, based in Austin, Texas. Her work has also appeared in Politico, NPR, The New Republic, Washington Monthly, and Law 360. Before I toss it to Nicole, I just want to put in a plug for democracyjournal.org. If you're not familiar with the journal, or if you are, I hope you'll come take a look at this symposium and at a lot of the other work we publish, and which we try to get above the political fray and write about the ideas behind these important matters. So having said all that, I want to thank you all for joining and hand it over to Nicole.
Thanks so much, Michael. I just wanted to start out by thanking all of our panelists and also Democracy for hosting this panel. I'm really hoping we'll get into some heated debates, but I wanted to start off by giving our panelists a chance to talk about their work and the pieces that they wrote for the symposium. I guess I'll start off with Doug, if that works for you.
Sure. Thank you for the chance to be here today, and Nicole for moderating, the other panelists, and Democracy for hosting the whole thing. My paper is really about the notion that immigration doesn't sit in a silo. It's not an issue in and of itself necessarily. It in fact affects the fabric of American life and is central to many of the challenges that we think about, especially economic challenges. So immigration can have a big impact on the top line pace of economic growth. It can contribute to productivity growth and higher real wages and advance in the standard of living. It can help us with our international competitiveness And it certainly can be a source of financial security for our entitlement programs and making sure that they remain in place for the foreseeable future. And so I wanted to sort of flesh out these ideas and point out that at the moment, immigration reform that recognizes these contributions is especially important. We've heard a lot about the decline in fertility during the pandemic, and what gets lost in the focus on the past year and a half is that we have seen sub-replacement fertility in the United States for a long time. The native-born population simply doesn't have enough babies to maintain this current size of the population. In the absence of immigration, the United States is Japan. It gets older, it gets smaller, it becomes less important on the world stage. The flip side to that is that immigration is a huge opportunity. It can dictate our future, the pace of the population growth, the growth in the labor force, and the composition of skills that we have available to fuel our economy. And that's an opportunity that I would love to see Congress and the administration take advantage of. If you look at the historical contribution of immigrants to the United States, it's enormous. Compared to the native-born population, immigrants work more, they work longer hours, they retire later, they disproportionately start businesses and hire people. 40% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are either immigrants or their children. This is a contribution that is an enormous record of success. And that's true despite the fact that we don't really focus our immigration policies on economic issues. Nearly 90% of visas are granted for humanitarian or family unification reasons, noble causes in and of themselves, but basically 12% come for economic objectives. And I think it would be sensible at this time to think about reforms that would focus more on the economic contribution. The one thing we all share as a nation is our economy, the opportunities it provides us and our children, and that can be a unifying force in the immigration debate and bring to the table things that everyone should have an interest in achieving. The paper also summarizes briefly a stylized reform that a colleague of mine, Jacqueline Veras, and I put together a little over a year ago. It is one of many reforms of this style. It really amounts to a two-part visa granting system that is focused on economic contributions. Part one is essentially glorified resume reading. You take a look at the individual, they speak English, they have a PhD, they've been in the labor force for 5 years, it's an outstanding resume. You assign points for each of those attributes, sometimes allowing extra points for governors if they have a particular need in an occupation or industry, but you assign points, and if a person gets over the point threshold, they're admitted into the United States. However, we all know there are lots of people out there who we've known who didn't have great high school records, maybe didn't have an unblemished resume in any way, but who are tremendous colleagues and great workers. And so there's a second track of a 3-year temporary visa where if you've got an employer who's willing to sponsor you in the US and you prove your value in the most American way in the market, providing your skills every day, generating something the employer values, that's a way to gain points as well. And so if a person completes 2 of those 3-year visas, they're awarded extra points. They have enough points to get in the queue for the regular point system and get granted into the US, and they're off and contributing as well. And so the big points of the paper are simple. They are that immigration should be viewed in the context of our other pressing policy challenges, and we have many, that in looking at the economic contribution, we have something that can unify the debate around something we all benefit from, which is a stronger economy, more opportunity in the future, and that this stylized point system plus experience approach has been successful in other countries, could be successful in the United States, and really ought to be on the table in addition to the other things we hear so much about: legalization, border security, and the like. And so I'm thrilled to have a chance to be here today to talk about those ideas, and was pleased to have the chance to write about them in Democracy, the Journal. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. I'm really hoping to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of the points-based system and just sort of, how we can fill the skills gap in the US. But before we do that, I do want to give our other panelists a chance to describe what their articles we're on. So Silva, would you mind going next?
Sure. Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Michael, for approaching me to contribute to this symposium. And thanks for Nicole for moderating this panel. I'm very, very happy to be here and very interested to hear from all these other wonderful speakers. So just taking a step back to talk a little bit about the piece that I wrote for the symposium. I wrote this piece on the current global refugee crisis and how the time is ripe for the United States to step up to share the responsibility in refugee resettlement. And, you know, this past month's news have really grabbed our attention with displaced Afghans and then Haitian asylum seekers at the border. It has really brought these contemporary humanitarian crises into the spotlight. But, you know, global refugee crisis has been worsening almost every year. And these are just reminders for us that are very, very stark. For example, like the global need for refugee resettlement is highest as it has ever been, almost like 82.4 million people. They've been forcibly displaced from their homes, which means that they are forced to flee their homes. And among them, about 20.7 million are refugees, registered as refugees by the UNHCR, which is the UN agency that handles refugees. And in this article, I kind of highlight some of the major global refugee situation and categorizing them into the old, new, and the emerging. And this, when I wrote the article, Afghanistan was not happening then, but it still gives you a sense of where people are, where refugees are coming from. And there are about 3 points that was very striking to me. Almost like 68 or 70% of all refugees originate from only 5 countries, and you can probably guess where they're from. Like they're from Syria, Venezuela. Afghanistan was here even before the crisis this year, and South Sudan and Myanmar. And the second point that was very striking to me, that most of these refugees are hosted by developing countries. So countries that are not really well equipped to deal with refugees are the ones that are hosting them. Almost like 86% are there. And the other one that was new and also very striking was that there are these intersections between violence, armed conflict, food insecurity, and climate change. This is, I think, one of the topics that is going to gain more and more attention as we learn more about this. But the humanitarian world is attempting to be responsive to some of these very, very complex issues within the laws that are on the books right now, and it is very challenging. And then just going back to resettlement, resettlement is just one of the several durable solutions for refugees. And even when we hear so much about it, only like 1% of the refugee population actually gets resettled every year. And then that too, like 2020 was, as you can guess, it was one of the worst years for resettlement due to COVID-19. And even before COVID-19, the US refugee resettlement system has suffered like major blows under the Trump administration, specifically because the annual decrease in presidential determination under the Trump administration that it sets the ceiling for refugee resettlement slots. It impacted almost every aspect of resettlement. We can talk more about it, but basically it broke down the local infrastructure that really implements and supports resettlement of refugees when they first come in and support them for the years after. So when the Biden administration took office in 2021, it took a 180-degree turn in policies. It raised the ceiling. And it also raised, for next year, we have about 125,000 ceiling set for the next year too. But, the refugee system had been broken down so much, and because of, all of the policies in the last 4 years during the Trump administration, and as well as the as well as because of the pandemic, only about 11,400 refugees were resettled this year, which is lower than 15,000 that was previously set by the Trump administration. So we didn't even meet that. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and I'm sure the administration is quite aware of it because of how it needed to be strong for the Afghani displaced people, and that it wasn't, it wasn't there yet, but they're trying. So what my paper kind of suggests is that as a new administration is reprioritizing refugee resettlement, it should really examine the program, because there were problems. Problems were there even before the system was broke down under the Trump administration. But it should also identify its strengths and weaknesses and make necessary changes to almost modernize it, because it hasn't really changed since it started in like 1980s. And I brought up like 3 points that I feel like is very important when they do this. There are more, obviously, but I feel like they should prioritize refugee integration along with self-sufficiency, because that is like self-sufficiency is one of the main aims of the main goals of the program, to get refugees into jobs as soon as possible, which is very important. But what is also important is to balance it with integration and make sure that they have what they need to better integrate or integrate more quickly, and their needs are met accordingly. So those things need to be balanced. The second point that is very important also is almost explore beyond the current federal model. And I think the administration is trying to do that. And the way to do that is almost expanding like community co-sponsorship programs and exploring private co-sponsorship programs. And we can talk more about this as well. The next thing, and is also the most important thing, is to really bring stability to the refugee program, to make it very resilient to administration changes or whatever changes in like policies there are, and that means supporting local resettlement agencies in every way possible, so that it cannot be broken down like it was, because it takes years and years to build. So I'm going to stop right there, and obviously very happy to take questions on this.
Thanks, Silva. It does seem like there's finally real political momentum behind rebuilding the refugee resettlement program. I'm hoping we can get into some of the innovations that the Biden administration has recently introduced in that respect. But first, I'll hand it off to Todd finally.
Well, I think that's a great segue, because I think what I wrote on was like kind of where we are in this moment and where there's opportunity, where there's unfilled opportunities so far, and really try to put that into like historical context. And I do agree that the historic decimation of the refugee resettlement program and admissions is something that you are seeing some really positive momentum on. What I tried to do in my article is really lay out that this is like a huge moment in time. We have an immigration system that is really fundamentally built from laws passed in the middle of the last century. Substantial improvements to really the creation of the modern immigration system in 1965. In 1986, a substantial, what's called the Reagan amnesty, that gave a pathway to citizenship to just under 3 million people. And then, kind of the modern legal immigration system and some huge substantial improvements in 1990. And really since then, in the subsequent 3 decades, you have not seen real positive momentum, particularly in Congress. There have been good things like DACA, for example. There have been legislative efforts. There were certainly tweaks and improvements to the system. But really what you've seen is the modern immigration enforcement environment growing out of a law passed in 1996 that really creates people being trapped as undocumented. What do I mean by that? People basically who are, once they're here, and this isn't everyone, for more than a year, they lose the ability to adjust status en masse. You do have a large number of people crossing the southwest border, many more people than have crossed even this year, to put that into historical context. And essentially you get a large population trapped here. And that after 2000 and after 9/11, you see this kind of increased enforcement environment that has really continued to this day. And that, you did have, really for a long time, you had President Bush, who promised to do comprehensive immigration reform. That got delayed. He made an effort at it, and it really was a bipartisan effort in 2006 and 2007. Won't get into the particulars of that bill. You saw that effort. You saw President Obama elected, saying he would do a comprehensive immigration reform push. That got pushed. They did a DREAM Act push, but it failed. They did DACA. I think a lot of us would celebrate it as a big win, although one that I think we see is extremely tenuous, to put it mildly, in the courts. You saw a 2013 effort. But really where we are today, coming out of the Trump administration, is I think a real question of what can get done legislatively, and what can the Biden administration do. So some things that we talked about were, one, how do you rebuild the legal immigration system? The number of people coming here and getting green cards per capita is actually about a third lower. This is putting aside where things were in 2020 with the pandemic, but it's about a third lower than it was for the last couple of decades. We just haven't increased that. We haven't improved these legal immigration avenues. I think Doug's proposal is a really exciting one to talk about. What are the opportunities there coming out of the Trump administration, just administratively make this work better, whether it's the refugee system, whether it's people coming here on guest worker visas, whether it's the LPR system. Had the Trump administration been successful, the cuts that they put forth would have cut the legal immigration system by 92%. We forget about some of these things now, but these healthcare bans and all the pandemic restrictions were an unprecedented assault on legal immigration avenues. As much as he talked about the wall, as much as we remember things as we should in the horrors of family separation, it's really important to understand, like, there was this effort to restrict legal immigration and grind it to a halt. So how do you rebuild that? Huge questions on asylum policy and refugees. I think, and I know, Nicole, you have written about this, I think a lot of the policy and rhetorical promises made during the campaign have yet to come to fruition. We remain deeply disappointed. The Title 42 remains in place. We are extremely disappointed that Remain in Mexico is now being re-implemented. We call on the administration to take all efforts there to do that. We think that you can and must be a country that can welcome people seeking asylum, but it can't all be about asylum. We need a robust refugee program. We need to make it so people can come in. It's not all this pressure at the border here. The Biden administration said they were going to create these legal immigration avenues, guest worker programs, a Western Hemisphere refugee program, in-country processing. We need a holistic approach to managing forced migration in the Western Hemisphere, and we don't have that. And we believe that we can and must protect people's right to seek asylum, but we need to build systems so that it's not just all people coming to the border, and way too much of that is happening today. And the last point I would say that we really called the question on is, like, what can get done for the undocumented? These are all critical issues for a lot of folks. The pathway to citizenship and legal status has been kind of, if there is one central ask for a lot of folks, that has been a huge part of it for many, many years. And unfortunately, we are, I just want to be really clear, at a point where there is not a clear path to 60 votes in the United States Senate on the pathway to citizenship. There's not a clear path to 60 on what this comprehensive framework is that people talked about, which was essentially improving and modernizing legal immigration, a pathway to citizenship, and security provisions. You're not seeing that debated in Congress. We are fully invested, I want to be clear, in trying to get what now looks like the best chance for immigration relief, which would be multi-year work permits through the reconciliation process. Since I wrote, the parliamentarian said she's not going to permit a pathway to citizenship to happen that way. We are optimistic. We believe that would be transformative. But this is a really tight and narrow window, and like how to get big reforms through Congress in the years ahead is a real question. And so this is very uncertain where this heads for the administration, where this heads for Congress, where this heads for the country. And so we were just thrilled to be able to have this conversation today and to be a part of this. So
thanks so much, Todd. I think that sort of leads into one of the first questions I wanted to posit to all of our panelists to start out. I think broadly we've been talking about comprehensive immigration reform for practically a decade, and it's always ended in failure. So I guess I want to start off asking, why is this particular moment any different politically, economically, socially? How should lawmakers convey the urgency of this moment to the public, and vice versa, I guess? If anyone wants to jump in.
I can start. I just spoke, but look, I think it is important to note that you have seen substantial shifts within the parties over this. I think within the Democratic Party, you have seen a effort to immigration policy has become a more salient issue. That was happening. You know, the number of Democrats who voted for comprehensive immigration reform from 06 and 07 went up to 13. It went from about 2/3 of the party to the whole party. And then with Trump, there's been that ratcheting up. And obviously, like, a lot of the people who voted for comprehensive immigration reform are not there in the United States Senate who voted for it in 2013. And so whatever that bipartisan consensus that you're trying to find, and I think we all have views on what that should be, it's a lot harder than it was. I want to be clear. We didn't get that done, but there isn't some middle out approach that I think a lot of people see is super likely to happen right now. You know, I would say in some ways, it's maybe even harder to get something done now in terms of like broad bipartisan support than, you know, even when Trump was there on like Dream, and that sounds a little strange, but he didn't like being seen as mean to Dreamers. Like, if you remember on September 6th, the day after he repealed DACA, he said, no, I love the Dreamers. And that was like, Republicans could kind of get behind that. We didn't get that done. Obviously, his administration was staffed by people who wanted to eliminate every single immigration avenue. They ultimately won out. And I'm not apologizing for President Trump in any way, but I think this is a particularly hard political configuration we're in right now to get something done in terms of broad bipartisan support.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the current moment, you know, with Democrats going back and forth with the parliamentarian on various immigration reform proposals that could be passed via reconciliation, you know, I don't know. I think there's a lot of people right now who are skeptical as to whether that process will actually yield results. And I know the former Congressman Corbello wrote as part of this democracy symposium, you know, arguing that reconciliation isn't going to succeed, and Democrats have more of an interest in keeping immigration reform a live issue than actually fixing it. So I guess another question I had is, you know, should Democrats be at this point pushing to overrule the parliamentarian, or, you know, trying to pursue other bipartisan options right now? You seem to think, Todd, that there isn't room for compromise at this point. But, you know, I guess I worry that Democrats are risking seeming that they're punting the issue by placing this on the shoulders of the parliamentarian, and then sort of suffering minimal political consequences for doing so if it doesn't end up working out. So, yeah, I guess I'm just sort of curious, you know, what Democrats should be doing right now.
Can I say a few words about this sort of general setting issue?
Yeah.
So first of all, on the narrow piece, which is my CBO background, on the merits, I don't think legalization of any type belongs in reconciliation. Reconciliation is for things budgetary, and if it's not primarily budgetary in nature, it should not be done in reconciliation. I think that's where what the parliamentarian ruled, and that's the correct ruling. I also personally would much prefer that we do important immigration reforms in regular order and get buy-in from both sides so that we have legislation that is durable and representative of the breadth of views in the United States. And I'm going to just agree with Todd that that's really hard right now. And I don't want, having said that, I want to suggest that's a panacea. Let's go do that. It's not that easy. Second thing, though, it is true that different people have their different issues. Like there are folks who are concentrating on the border. There are folks who are worried about resettlements. There are folks worried about economic growth. The thing that unites them is immigration reform. And that case just needs to be made, I think, more forcefully, that you will not get everything you want in a bipartisan immigration bill. That's the nature of bipartisan legislation, right? They are basically coalition of the disgruntled who gets something but not everything. But that's what we need. We need something durable that touches on all pieces, because to do legalization without fixing the border and the core visa granting system is to go back to what we have right now at some level. And the border can't be done in isolation. And so I think the case, the policy case, maybe not the political case, but the policy case for a comprehensive immigration reform is stronger than it has ever been right now. And I'm going to agree with what Carlos Corbello said. I felt for a long time, and I'm not trying to pick a partisan fight, but when I was on the McCain campaign, for example, it sure felt like Democrats rather had immigration as an issue than an accomplishment. Republicans turn around and I think that was Trump's strategy. Let's just have immigration as an issue and not an accomplishment. Don't want to solve anything. And we have to get past the politics of keeping this an issue which is a disservice to the dreamers and millions of other people, and undercutting our future at the same time. That can no longer be okay. We have to fix that.
Can
Yeah,
I just
definitely. Go
add
ahead.
something to that? Yes, I think I mean, I agree with both Doug and Todd in a lot of different points. It has to, I think in the ideal world, what I would really love is have a comprehensive immigration reform that is bipartisan and then has all those different it's multi-pronged. It gets at all these really complicated issues at the same time, because you actually cannot really do one thing and really ignore the other. For us to actually develop an actual immigration system that is fair, workable, and that can last, and that's modern too. So I do agree that, but I think in this moment it's important to also realize that the more we push trying to give relief to millions of people, the harder it's going to be. So I do agree that we should be pushing for whatever is possible to give them some relief, at least. And the ideal is obviously a pathway to citizenship, but whatever gives them status and gives them some relief to work legally, I think that is worth pursuing. But I agree. I mean, ideally, we would want like all of these different issues dealt with it together.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Silva. I do want to just take a moment to welcome Claudia. She has joined the Zoom. I just wanted to, we went through all of our panelists' articles and they spoke a little bit about what they wrote. So I wanted to give you the same opportunity, Claudia.
Thanks, Nicole. And it's so great to be in such a wonderful panel with so many great experts and my colleague, Silva. So again, my name is Claudia. I'm with the Center for American Progress. I co-author a piece that looks specifically at the economic impacts of immigrants in this country. I'm sure we have discussed on this panel today some of the sort of moral implications behind getting a pathway to citizenship, but also talking about broader immigration reforms. But what we focus on was specifically on why providing relief to millions of undocumented immigrants is also an economic imperative for the country. We have all seen the impact of this pandemic. It's definitely something that I mean, we're having this virtual panel as a result, and all of our lives have been upended in a way. But the reality is that for millions of undocumented Americans who have been here for nearly 2 decades, not only did they have to, face this health and financial crisis as a result of the pandemic, but they also had to navigate much of, this past year without, pretty much zero support from the federal government because many were left out. So despite some of these exclusions, undocumented immigrants are making significant contributions, whether, that is at the local level, at the state level, but they occupy the majority of industries that the federal government deemed essential during this pandemic, right? We, estimated that about 5 million of them are considered essential workers. So, there are these severe implications when you have a system that has been operating for so many years, but that has not given a lot of these workers the formal recognition that they need to fully join the workforce. And that is why the Center for American Progress has been pushing for immigrant provisions in this Build Back Better agenda, because the case that we make through our piece is that you simply cannot build back better without having the foundation of the people who are going to, drive your infrastructure agenda, right? We're talking about, 1 in 5 construction workers being an undocumented American. So immigrants are overrepresented in a lot of these industries that we are going to need to carve this path forward and to essentially build, what could be a better future for all of us. So that is what we focus on the piece. There are, many numbers that, we highlight a piece that we had worked on with some economists looking specifically at how many trillions of dollars would be added to the national GDP as a result of a pathway to citizenship for specific groups of immigrant populations, including folks like Dreamers and temporary protected status holders. But at the end of the day, I think what's important is that immigrants have responded to conditions of uncertainty in a way that, you have seen their mobility, you have seen just how active they are in some of these areas. So if you actually recognize them and you give them these, tools and these reliefs so that they can, be part of the formal economy, you are just going to unleash even more benefits. And I think that is why it's, sometimes very frustrating when we see Congress kind of dragging its feet on some of these provisions, because we really see it as a net benefit to the nation. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Nicole. Thanks.
Thanks, Claudia. That actually sort of leads into a question that I was hoping to ask, which is, do you think that the most helpful way to frame the immigration debate, especially for moderates who might be skeptical of raising immigration levels and sort of bringing more people into the tent of comprehensive immigration reform, is to sort of frame the debate in terms of what immigrants can offer America economically? I think there's arguments to be said that, immigrants are only seen for their economic contributions, and that is a bad thing. But do you see that as sort of a key way to communicate to the public why this is a policy imperative?
So I think it's both, right? I think we definitely realize that immigrants are people, right? They're humans. They deserve having the certainty and peace of mind so that they can continue living in this country, raise their families, go to work, and build their best futures. But I think there is a very strong argument, and one that particularly at this time when a lot of the conversations, not just on Capitol Hill, but even at the state level, are focused on how do we rebuild? How do we respond to some of the economic challenges that have resulted from this pandemic? So I think there is a very strong argument there. Immigrants have been so active in the labor force. We have seen a shortage for many years in this country. And we see, immigrants, as I was mentioning earlier, really represented in every single industry. But the reality is that they are also, while they're representing some industries, like, we definitely see them in, the dairy industry. I was just talking to folks from Wisconsin about, the critical role that immigrants are playing there. But, aside from food processing, from, working the field, from, working in childcare, right? We talk about the childcare agenda, but many childcare workers are immigrants. The reality is that, if you provide this pathway, you are also extending other avenues in other industries. So you are essentially diversifying that labor force, and that is really important. Because I think right now, we see a lot of immigrants in the service industry. We definitely saw a lot of them being essential during the pandemic. And, if they're able to get a work permit, if they're able to become authorized and actually enter the labor force in a more formal way, then those undocumented immigrants can also obtain jobs that better match those skill sets. So we're talking about specializing the workforce and, what's the future of workforce? And immigrants can play a huge role there. But unfortunately for undocumented Americans, they have been restricted to a lot of industries because because of, being excluded basically of a system. So I think there is a strong argument to be made there. There's also an important argument, on the economics of it, just in terms of, I think a lot of Americans wonder, how does this impact me? Why should I care about immigration? Why should I care about providing a pathway? And the reason why you should care is because, these are people that are like going in their day by day in your community. They are spending just like you, they're consumers, they're workers. And the reality is that, what we find is that providing that relief for immigrants doesn't benefit just the immigrant, as an individual, but it actually increases opportunity for families and for locals community, right? Their spending power rises. A good case example is in the case of Dreamers, with the DACA program, which has benefited more than 800,000 people since, it was started in 2012. Every time we survey Dreamers, we find that the majority of them are employed, they're in school, they're obtaining other certificates, so what we see is like this mobility of immigrants pursuing additional opportunities, additional educational opportunities. So you want that in a workforce if you want to stay competitive in a global economy. So I think, that is a very strong argument, and one that I would hope, more people will take seriously so that we can, have a more prosperous future for every single American in this country.
So
Definitely.
I would emphasize, I think you want to do immigration reform that is appropriate for 15 and 20 years now. You want something that's absolutely durable. But the reason to do it now is that you get an extra benefit as you try to recover from the pandemic. And so that the urgency of the moment argument comes from things like that. And I think, these are important points on the economy. This is the thing we share and the thing we all benefit from and should be part of this discussion. And hopefully it will be in the near future.
Yeah, maybe this is a good opportunity to get into your proposal for how we should re-envision the immigration system to emphasize just sort of economic contributions. So just to summarize, you argue that the US should adopt a points-based system, much like that of Canada and Australia. And I know a lot of policymakers have looked to those countries as examples in the past, but I think one question I have about it is, one of the weaknesses of those systems is that they don't provide the same sort of formal pathways for low and semi-skilled workers to immigrate. Because I know in Australia, recruitment of immigrants in those sectors has kind of become dominated by workers on other visas that were originally intended for other purposes. So I guess in this current environment where the US is facing a labor shortage across a lot of low wage sectors, from construction to hospitality, I'm wondering how you think a points-based system should deal with that challenge of recruiting needed workers across skill levels, even if they don't have a job in the US, prior to coming.
So let me say a few things about the points-based system. The first is, I don't really like the idea that the only thing we want are high-skilled people have PhDs in economics like me. That's a terrible way to run an immigration system. So yes, we propose a points-based system, and that point-based system reflects the opportunities to contribute to the economy. So it has your education, your age, your experience. We allow for local economic preference, sort of particular high demand occupations or industries, and provide points for that. And I think there's a place for that. I think that'd be very beneficial. But there's also points for someone who is a graduate of the temporary visa system. And that's the place where we envision those with less beautiful resumes, the more low-skilled workers, more people with little experience, less English proficiency, coming in, having an employment match with an employer, working for 3 years, getting renewed, working for 3 more years, and at that point being awarded points into the regular system because you have demonstrated your value in the market. And people do that, and that's a great way to really understand value. And so we specifically put it in to deal with that critique of points-based systems. You don't want it to exclude those people. The economy needs them, needs a range of skills always, and will in the future, and we wanted to get that. The other thing I'd say about the points-based system is we didn't go to points because I'm an economist, I don't have a soul. I mean, that's true. But the reason that I think the points are valuable at the moment is they take out of the debate the identity politics. We do actually turn a person into points. And I think at the moment, given how volatile the debate has been and how harsh it gets, it's better to say, hey, we don't know anything about this person. They're an abstract, and they're here to provide an enormous contribution to this economy from which we'll all benefit. I want that person. And take out of it like, oh, they're a dreamer, we're doing it for dreamers, or we're doing it for those people. I think that has merit, but I mean, that hasn't worked so far. So let's try something else.
Yeah, I mean, I guess another thing I'm wondering is like, in sort of forming the criteria, for which immigrants we might want to emphasize, should diversity among those immigrants be sort of a value? I think, one concern is that that immigrants could be under the system, like overall whiter and wealthier. And like, is that something that we would necessarily want to value? So yeah.
So again, you can put points in for lots of things. I mean, and we, for example, envision points for family preference, right? Family unification has been a core of the U.S. immigration system from its beginning, and you can accommodate that desire within the point system. You could accommodate a desire for diversity within a point system. That I think is in the end going to be part of the debate. So our sketch of, and I don't want to overstate its details, our sketch of this type of reform really doesn't, I don't want to go to the wall for our point system. I want the point system that will get through the House, the Senate, be signed by the president. that point system is a good one.
Yeah,
Can
definitely.
I
I mean,
just hop in there? Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, Todd knows tons about these things. What's his take?
No, I know. I think it's also important to keep in mind that like immigration policy is littered with people passing policies and then like radically being off on like future flow. So there's this like very famous example in 1965 of Teddy Kennedy closing the deal on ending the racial quota system. And he goes to a bunch of segregationalists and says, don't worry, the reason, so they originally were going to do a system that was more heavily tilted towards people coming tied to a specific job. And you can go back and you can read local news stories that says like, we can't do the Kennedy immigration flood, they called it. We will be flooded with cheap Brazilian doctors. Like this was the demagoguery of the time, okay? We were concerned about this. And by we, I mean other people. But so Kennedy goes in and he's like closing the deal. And he says, okay, we're gonna move away from kind of more employment-based immigration system. And we're gonna move to a family-based immigration system because I've got to be able to tell a bunch of segregationists that it's not going to change, I think it was like the racial and ethnic makeup of the country. And because in the preceding 70 years, something like 90+% of 100 years probably had come from Europe in terms of people coming through immigration systems. The idea was that like, and there's an extreme, you had barred people from parts of Asia. There's like the idea was people have been coming from Europe, people's family are from Europe. We're gonna have a family-based immigration system. So Europeans are gonna come, and particularly like, Northern Western Europeans. They signed off on the deal and boom. But then it turns out there were these like much larger patterns in place, and you opened up, what this bill ended up doing was you had the first waves of substantial, really in almost 100 years, substantial migration from Asia and Latin America and these places here. So I both think it's really important to think about, and I think Doug is right, like, however you're trying to like make these categorical assignments or points-based systems or other categories, like you're making these active choices. And like, you're gonna be wrong in a lot of cases of what it may be in some cases. Like, I think it is a very reasonable expectation to look to the future and say, 20 years from now, in the way that we've seen this huge increase in employment-based immigration from India over the last 20 years, Nigeria could be a country where there's a huge number of people coming. Lots of English speakers, highly educated, there's a growing population here now, but that could be totally wrong. And so I think that's like an important thing just to keep in mind of how often this is people have guessed wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to give Silva an opportunity to talk, but I'm also sort of curious as to how you would build flexibility into a system like this, because it seems sort of impractical to be going to Congress every time you need to amend it to just keep pace with the realities that we're seeing play out. But yeah, Silva, please go.
Yeah, so I'm learning a lot, and I think I'm very, very intrigued as well. We haven't done a lot of research on future flows, but I know we've just been really embroiled in what is happening right now, I guess. But really interested to hear more about it and how you actually get to a system like that so that it's still fair and it still makes sense. But I did want to put a little bit of plug into some of the problems that exist even like right now, even when you're just talking about a little bit more higher skilled professions like doctors. So before the pandemic, I started doing some research on like rural healthcare and finding more about how immigrant doctors played such a huge role in some of these places. Like there's one Indian doctor for hours on end that was serving an area. It was a really eye-opening research for me. But I also realized like how hard it was, even if there were doctors, even if they were serving, and even if there was this one doctor. It was just the immigration story that each one of them had was so unique. And I totally understood, being an immigrant myself, everybody has to kind of chart their own path to get to where they want. And at the end of the day, they were just trying to be doctors. One of the biggest one was especially for doctors from bigger countries like India and China, the wait period for green cards were like 100 years. So they'll probably never really see it. And it was very depressing for them. But just want to, and then after the pandemic happened, I started to look into, more about what states were doing. And it was just more of a scramble to get, doctors or immigrant doctors to be in places where there should be. And it really showed how really broken the system is, because a lot of these policies that were put in place were ad hoc and trying to get over the red tape. So just while I am very interested to know about the point system and everything else, I do want us to be aware that there are like existing issues in the system right now, and people waiting in long backlogs right now that also need attention in terms of like getting them what they deserve, since they've served so long in some of these communities.
So Nicole, one answer to your question is to look at what the Canadians do, which is, they have a set of criteria to admit someone, but they're committed to the success of their immigration policies, and they track the success of people admitted to Canada, and they track them longitudinally year after year, check in on them, see how they're doing. And if it turns out they're not doing well, they didn't have the criteria that are needed for success in the Canadian country, they adjust the points, and you can build that into the system so that you have a way to correct for errors, because Todd is right. It won't be right for the future, but we're wrong all the time. I will make the following pitch, which is my framing of the large migration issue that's going on in the globe right now. When if you go back to the 90s and we sort of saw this globalization wave, the consensus in the economic profession is that all the capital was in the West and the aging countries, Europe, the United States, Japan, places like that. All of the labor was in the Middle East and the former Soviet republics. And since nature abhors a vacuum, the capital would go to the labor, and we'd have this internationalization of portfolios, and the capital would come in and would raise the standard of living in those places and provide employment, and would provide retirement savings for the older Western economies, and we'd have this sort of economic bliss. And it just didn't happen, right? And for any number of reasons, inability to enforce contracts, political economy problems, the capital really didn't flow that way. It stayed in these countries. But economics does abhor a vacuum. And so now the labor is coming for the capital. And we're seeing a lot of real strong economic reason for migration from those places into the places that have the capital. So if the US is going to be a place where people want to migrate for economic reasons, let's have an immigration system that recognizes and takes advantage of that. And that, I think, is something that will be true 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think generally in this conversation, we've been trying to get away from discussion of the southern border, and maybe the media's focus on the border is a little bit misplaced, or at least at the expense of other issues here. But I do wonder to what extent you see this system for reforming, legal immigration as also sort of combating this perpetual cycle of crises at the border, because it is my understanding that for many of these people who are arriving, they may have economic motivations, and an asylum is their only legal pathway to the US, even though they may also qualify for asylum. It's sort of an overloaded system right now. So I guess I'm sort of curious as to how we change that dynamic.
Well, I'm not an expert on the southern border, and I'll defer to anyone who is, but we had southern border crises under Bush, under Obama, under Trump, now under President Biden. And so it doesn't have anything to do with the policies of particular administrations. It has to do with our immigration system. And so I think, it gives us a chance to do the reforms that accommodate the economic migration in a sensible fashion, and then simultaneously fix the border security, which, as I said, is not the thing I know much about.
Yeah, I think one way to think about this is we don't have ways for people to come legally to the United States that work. And we particularly don't have those for certain places in the Western Hemisphere that aren't Mexico. So for example, if you think about, if you are in Guatemala or Honduras, and you are in a place where, because of a famine, because of a hurricane, because of climate change, because of really, really, really awful state-sanctioned gang violence, your life is in very serious danger. The international refugee system and asylum system was largely designed to stop a second Holocaust, like, or something short of it. It was designed in the wake of World War II. And it has been tweaked since then, and Silva should talk to it. But we do not have the ability for someone who's like, I'm facing starvation in these countries, and there is a labor market in the United States where I can go and my family cannot starve to death. Like there is, that is not, we don't have like a good system to get you here. To put it in context, when we, from Mexico, we have about 250,000 temporary work visas a year, H2A, H2B, and there's substantial challenges there that we could get into, but people can come, they can do seasonal work, and they can go back. In Central America, where the population is about a third the size of Mexico, we had 5,000 work visas in 2019. Like we just do not have a functional way for people to come. The family-based immigration system is completely backlogged, which people mentioned. You've got to wait a decade in some cases to come, which functionally means it doesn't work. And we should have the ability for people to come. And like, I want to fight for those parents who are able to, who make it to the Southwest border or for a better life for them, some of their families. But I also want it so they can just get on an airplane and come to the United States and work and fulfill those things. And to the points people have raised, whether they are going to go and be an AI researcher at Carnegie Mellon, or whether they are someone who is going to move to Pittsburgh and is going to be able to, work as a hospital administrator or in the back of a hospital there. Like these are people we want, and we want to fight for those families and their parents because it's the right thing to do, because it benefits us. And we just don't have the ability to do that. And so I think so much of what you see politicized at the southern border is downstream from a system that forces people into this incredibly perilous and, quite frankly, politically unsustainable journey that we just see over and over and over again, that over the long term, you cannot and should not deter your way out of.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is sort of an opportunity to get a little bit into humanitarian channels for people to come here. And so I sort of want to ask some questions of Silva. I think you've written a lot about the sort of ways that the Biden administration could reform the refugee program and sort of the contributions of refugees to the US. But I wanted to shift gears and sort of talk about the Biden administration's recent announcement that it will allow private sponsorship of Afghan refugees for resettlement in the US. And it certainly seems like it would expand the US's capacity to receive those refugees. But I also think there's some concerns that, well-meaning people who don't have the required expertise in refugee resettlement could also get involved, and that, refugee agencies who might be in a position to help them don't necessarily have the funding to do that. So I'm just curious what you think about that policy and how you see that playing out, Silva.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, this co-sponsorship model or private community, there are like two types. There's a community co-sponsorship that United States actually already had it in the books before, but some organizations used it, some didn't use it. But it's an idea that has been there for a while. But then there's another called private co-sponsorship, which gives much more responsibility to a community groups than just much more responsibility than the community co-sponsorship groups. So having said that, I think it's a good idea, and I'm very, very encouraged to see that in this moment in time, they are going forward and starting to think about it even more seriously than they did before. I think the Biden administration did mention that they were going to expand, but I think with the Afghan displaced Afghanis, the moment was just so important that we need more people, like more hands on deck. And I think they really wanted to pair the support that different states, different people are showing in Afghans, because I think it's almost unprecedented the way these refugees have been welcomed in different states that we have not really seen in the last 4 or 5 years. Mostly it had been more negative towards immigrants, towards refugees. Refugees were not really politicized before. But in the last 4 or 5 years, it had become more of a political issue too. So, but for this moment, people have been very, sympathetic. People want to help. Small community groups are like, okay, collecting things, going to airports and receiving people. So I think they're really banking on that support and hoping that veterans and others who have like a more direct connections with the Afghan displaced people, they're going to step up. And the point about giving it more structure, as I said, there are different models of it already. The one that's been the longest is up in Connecticut. It's Immigrant IRIS. The short form is IRIS. It's Immigrant Refugee Integration Services, and they've been doing this for a long time. And they are actually part of the group that was announced. I think they're one of the groups that are helping the Biden administration to establish this program. So there is precedence there, and given that they've done this for such a long time, and then there are other groups there, other people there that have like been solely focused on co-sponsorship models. So there are people there to make sure the correct types of checks and balances are placed. For example, do the groups have enough money? Do the groups have enough people? Like, is the commitment strong? Like, there are different types of checks and balances there that can be placed on these different groups, so that refugees are not just like I'm responsible for you, but I don't know you. That doesn't happen. The groups are like totally responsible for the care, and there are so many positives to community co-sponsorship models, because it really makes sure the integration aspect of it is very different, because the people who are actually resettling them are from the community, so they have those connections. They already know where things are. They already have connections to other community members. So the integration is much more natural. The trust that you build among people who have just newly arrived and people in the community is like much more organic. So there are a lot of positives to these, the way the resettlement happens, if we can do it the right way. And I think the program is called like sponsor circles programs for Afghans. Yeah, so I mean, so I'm really excited to see how, and it was just announced this week, I think. So I was really excited to see that it was announced, and I know that that the people who are leading it are experts. So I'm interested to see how it actually goes. And that was one of our, in the paper that I wrote, that was one of our one of our policy solution as well. So, and I think it should be expanded to other groups, not just for Afghans. We could be much more vested in refugees.
Definitely. I mean, I guess in a way we're sort of only in this position of, I think this has been talked about, like private sponsorship of refugees for a long time, but it does seem that the imperative to implement it now was mostly a result of the fact that refugee agencies were decimated under Trump. So you make another sort of crucial point in your article, which is that, refugee agencies are really vulnerable to changes in administration, and especially with Trump slashing the number of refugees to record lows. So I guess my question is also, how can the US make refugee agencies more robust to the politics of immigration? And I guess that also sort of extends to the asylum system as well, in terms of like executive policies being used to slash the number of asylum seekers who are allowed to come to the US. How can we make humanitarian channels more robust to those kinds of politics?
Right, and that's actually that's $1 million question too. And some of the people that have so I did research like end of 2020, where I talked to some about 30 refugee experts, and one of the points that they mentioned was that they really need to have almost a stable ceiling, like maybe the Congress needs to pass a stable ceiling of 80,000 people. Like, you don't have to decide it every year. If that is stabilized, that kind of flows through making the local infrastructure more stronger and all of that. So that kind of also helps it from being unstable because of administration changes. So that, and I know anything that you have to pass to Congress is hard, but that is one of the, I think, the biggest one that we would want, some type of a stable ceiling with some flexibility for the president to respond to emergency situation where you need to take in much more people. So some of that should be built in. So I think that's one way, and another way is. Many refugee organization, local organizations just shut down. I think about when it started in 2016, there were about 300, and by the time the Trump administration left, about 134 had closed or zeroed out. So that's a huge loss of organizations. But so one of the things the survivors, the local agencies that survived actually did was they really pivoted and they really diversified, so that they're not really doing one thing and not really just focusing on refugees. They were really diversifying the population that they were serving. The low-income communities or refugees that had already been there because there was no more refugees coming in. They also diversified the funding sources so that they were not completely dependent upon federal government. So diversification was key, and that point has carried through since after 9/11, when the refugee system shut down during that time too. So that time too, the organizations kind of took to those strategies and kind of did that again during the Trump administration. So I think to make themselves more resilient, they need that support. But the program itself needs to give much more support to local resettlement organizations in building those connections, building those relationships, and making themselves stronger. If that makes sense.
Definitely. I did want to sort of get back to the idea of creating new legal pathways for future flows of immigration. And one is that sort of you discussed in your piece, Silva, is, you mentioned that the US will increasingly face more climate refugees in the years and decades to come. And I know that Julian Castro proposed on the campaign trail in 2020 to create a new category of climate refugees. And I can pose this to the group, but also specifically to Silva, should the US do that? I know there's been some disagreement in academic circles about this in terms of, it potentially coming at the expense of people who are traditionally considered refugees, and it just could be just a very large population. But, in lieu of that, is there any other way that the US can make a commitment to climate refugees without diluting what it means to be a refugee?
So I have not really looked too deeply into that, but this is, I think, the next frontier in humanitarian. I will see more and more of it. And I feel like academics, the humanitarian world, everybody is kind of trying to figure this out within the laws, international laws of refugees, because climate refugees as a word doesn't even really exist in the UNHCR dictionary. They're not, it's not there, but they've been trying to really publish guidelines and trying to see, are there, armed conflict or anything else that, along with climate refugees, climate, problems that you can tag on to, so that you can put them in the bucket that we already have. So they're trying to make all these different type of adjustments to make sure that they're responsive to it. They're very aware, obviously, but for the US, I think US has a moment in this moment to really take the lead too, and to think of programs, to create new pathways, like whatever it is, to get at these a very different kind of refugees, and making sure that we are prepared for the years to come. So I'm very heartened to see that we're starting to think about it, but we do need to be very creative because the laws aren't just there yet. So yeah.
Definitely. I might take the opportunity to go and address some of the Q&A questions in the chat. So I think here's one for Doug. is there any evidence that immigrants might be competing with Black Americans for jobs requiring minimal skills? It seems to be a concern of the Black community. Our audience member is asking.
There's a general concern that immigrants will compete for jobs, drive down wages, and otherwise harm the economic prospects of the native-born population, African Americans or others. And I would argue that the evidence for that is really missing. The Mariel boat lift is a famous episode in immigration economics. An enormous influx of extremely low skilled workers into the Miami area. And so concentrated labor market, very single type of labor coming in. And economists have looked for decades to try to find the damage to the native Miami workforce from that episode. And they really can't make the definitive case that it happened. And if you can't find that, you're not going to find it more broadly in the United States, which has enormous labor markets and lots of places where people can migrate to and lots of internal sorting. So I think that fear, and it's a real fear people have, is overstated. Instead, the bulk of the evidence is that by and large, the arrival of immigrants is a beneficial thing for the native-born population. They're not identical. They tend to be complements in the labor market. And so it tends to raise wages, raise the standard of living. And one of the reasons I think that's true is that by and large, you're already competing with everyone on the globe anyway. The labor gets embodied in products which are traded around the globe. And so wages have had to adjust to that competition already. And the movement of a person from across the street or across the state border or across an ocean really doesn't affect things that much. And so while I understand the concern, and I think one of the dominant political themes of our time is fear, I think that fear is overstated, and a real close look at the evidence suggests that's not going to happen.
I think just to build on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. No, please.
No, Todd. Yeah, I have a different thought.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, if people really want to go down in the weeds, I do suggest you can read a lot about the Mariel boat lift. The kind of only famous economist left who talks about wage displacement is a guy named George Borjas. He has actually even come around to now backing off some of his initial claims. Where you do see, I want to be clear, the evidence is extremely clear that immigration as a whole, even within a broken system, does not have a negative impact on wages. Two, if you have certain types of immigration and immigrants coming in, it increases wages through job creation, lots of things like that. Where you do see that you can have challenges is not immigrants, but if you have a large undocumented population who doesn't have access to basic employment rights, because if you can hire someone for $4 an hour, there's certain industries where you've seen that. That is I just want to be clear, not affecting 99% of folks here. If you look at when I say non-college, I mean it's people who did not graduate high school in certain industries like construction. There are some wage depression. It is not because of immigrants, it's because people are denied legal status. And even George Borjas, who has been this immigrants' wages, has eventually come around to say he's put forth a theory that's actually well, the problem may be the lack of legal status here. He's kind of come around in the last 3 years. So, for years and years, there was this debate. There just isn't an academic debate on this. I agree with Doug. It's a fear that lots of communities and people have. This is not a real academic debate anymore, though, and I actually think it's just important to think about it that way too. So yeah.
I mean, to your point about the undocumented population, I also imagine that legalizing them would improve conditions for all workers because they can sort of organize and be able to identify unscrupulous employers and whatnot.
Absolutely. I mean, it is, again, and I think it's really important, it is the lack of access to the ability to get a minimum wage and benefits and things like that can have that effect. which is why, like, granting people legal status is a huge net benefit for people who are recent immigrants, people who family been here for 8, 10 generations, whatever that may be, and everything in between. So yeah.
Definitely. Sorry, Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, Nicole, I just want to add a few points, and I want to be super respectful. I know Doug is an economist. We wrote a little bit of a study that, Center for American Progress co-authored with Giovanni Perry, who is an economist, that, when we talk about generally, some of these topics, and Todd sort of alluded to this, there's different methodologies for how, economists really look at those impacts between sort of the native born workers and immigrants, and particularly depending on how those methodologies are presented, I think that's where you get, different assessments, and particularly one where, some may make the argument that like that would have a negative impact on wages. But on the flip side, I think the majority of folks have come to over time to this conclusion that there is this sort of net positive of having, immigrants, fill some of these jobs. And also looking specifically at the piece that we work with Perry, what we found is that if you actually were to provide a pathway for all undocumented immigrants, you would see over 10 years that all wages would go up for $600, right? That was like the measure, the calculation that he came up with. So we see this sort of positive impact. But I also want to kind of, I think, reframe the conversation, because oftentimes we focus on like the idea of like pay and productivity and what does this mean? And like, the reality is that like, you're having these like significant wealth gaps, and like obviously around racial lines. But it's really important to contextualize that like, if we are building policies that are actually creating good jobs, and by good jobs, I mean like that money is actually going to workers and not to like the very top percent, you are actually creating policies that are helping the economy become more prosperous for everyone. And what we have in this country isn't that, right? Like, and I think that's why it's so important that, even when you made that point about like, yes, if you actually legalize immigrants, you are creating potentially better conditions for all workers. And as you build worker power, you are also making this argument that you can then improve conditions for everyone else. And I also think it's important to think about, we oftentimes, and I think some folks may disagree with this, but I really hate sort of the term like, low scale versus high scale, because I don't know if you've seen farm workers working on the fields. That to me feels like very high skill, and I probably will not survive an hour doing it. But just for the purposes of immigration and some of this discussion, the reality is that a lot of high skilled workers are able to enter the workforce because we have these low wage immigrant workers, right? So the ability, for instance, like if you look at the childcare industry, right? Because we've been having this conversation, especially around the Build Back Better agenda. I mean, many women who are in very specialist occupations are able to go to work because they have someone that can take care of their children. And I think that is so important, right? And then even looking among low wage workers, in order to make the argument that you're really negatively impact another worker, you would have to have basically this condition where like people are essentially going for the same jobs. And what we are seeing is that that is not the case, right? Like we know that most Americans are not going into the field. We also know that, that we have some specific visas that are, bringing people to come work here for very specific purposes. So, you are diversifying that workforce, and that is so important, right? In terms of just, looking into the economy long term. So I do think that, that's oftentimes like an argument that we hear, like, are more immigrants going to hurt Native workers? But what we are actually seeing is that, like, if you do the opposite, which is restrict migration, which is what the past administration focused on doing, you are, harming not just the productivity of the United States, but you are also limiting some workers' ability to enter the workforce because of how much we depend on immigrants and how much we've created industries that have been, represented by immigrant workers. And there's, Black immigrant workers too, right? I think oftentimes our debate doesn't shed the light on that. And, even earlier, we talked about Afghans and, building systems that work. Afghans are going to have to sustain themselves and their family. They're going to have to work. And, instead of focusing so much on like restriction, enforcement, you have to create legal pathways, because that's the only way that you are essentially, creating conditions where like people do not have to then rely on those, jobs that mistreat them, or that, or that basically offer them little pay, because that's the only way they can sustain themselves, and the only way they can enter the workforce. So I think there is, many lessons that we can take. And what I would hope to see in the future is that we are having a more robust conversation about, especially in the policymaking space, about like, how does this impact each of us, right? Like, if the pandemic taught us anything, is that we depend on each other. I mean, so many working parents, had to rely on people. I mean, they saw the challenges. I mean, teachers, there's immigrants who are teachers, there's DACA recipients that are, represented in some of these most diverse districts, and they bring very unique skill sets. And so not everyone is going to, for the same job, but at the same time, we just saw how essential, right, some workers became, and how much we relied on them. I mean, we certainly couldn't, be on this Zoom if we had not had an immigrant who created this platform, right? So like, there are all these benefits. And I think, the point that I'm really trying to stress is that, like, we have to think about these kind of racial wage gaps in a different way, because there is this disconnect when, you actually have the wealth that is going to the very top, and the corporations that have already made the case for why they need immigrants. And then you have those at the bottom who are essentially, getting the lower fare of not just conditions, but wages. So, if you actually improve conditions for, all workers, particularly those low wage workers, you are creating, good jobs. And I think that's where we want to get. And that's where we hope, most Americans start paying attention to immigration, because the immigration debate is impacting you. And that is something that folks don't oftentimes think about.
Yeah, I think it is worth sort of framing this point in terms of like that, this is a way to bridge income inequality to some extent, but then also, we should view immigration in concert with sort of that as an issue, and solutions for immigration is working in tandem with solutions for other workers as well. Silva, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just want to bring back one point that Doug mentioned, and I've heard this from economists a lot. We have this sense that, our pie is limited. So, you add more people there, everybody's slices get smaller. But, economists say that more people means the pie actually gets bigger. So it's not that in the long run, you are we actually all have larger slices of pie. So that analogy has really stuck to me whenever I talk to people about immigration, because at the end of the day, immigrants are not just, working, they're also consumers. They'll also be buying stuff, they'll be building houses, they're doing all these things that is really great for, creating jobs or being more entrepreneurial, like everything, all of that, the good things that we talk about immigrants, like that is why the pie becomes bigger. So I really like that. So just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good analogy for looking at it for us non-economists. There was one more question in the Q&A that that's for Silva, particularly to your sort of emphasis on creating self-sufficiency for refugees. They're asking, what are your thoughts of sort of an English language requirement at some point in an immigrant resident? What are your thoughts about an English language requirement for refugees arriving in the US?
A requirement? Well, I wouldn't say that. Language learning is very immersive. Language learning, people can learn languages. So I wouldn't say that the people coming in as refugees should be required to have English language, because many of these, if you go back and think about who refugees are, they were not really expecting to just pick up and leave everything behind and move to another country and learn a different language. I don't think any one of us want to do that. So thinking about like where they're coming from, there's some of, just to take the latest Afghan example, they're just coming with like clothes off their backs. So you cannot really say that they need to be required to have English language skills, which it'd be helpful if they do, but I think what we need to really focus on is what we can do to make sure that they get those language skills, because those are actually very important in terms of finding a job and doing whatnot. And people do learn. I mean, the research that I did, I think in 2016, looked at English language skills, and they improve really well like the longer they're here. So as their English languages improve, they get better jobs. It's just a very immersive process. So we just have to make sure that there are programs and services in place that gives them an opportunity to learn like whatever skills they need in terms of language and whatnot, so that they can succeed, whether they want to work or whether they want to go to school and build more specialties. So I think it should, yeah, that is beyond the point, but I want to say that the program should be like strengthened and it should be there.
Great. Well, I think we're going to end there, but thank you so much to all of our panelists, and again for Democracy for hosting this panel. I'm glad we were able to get together and have a discussion today about this very important topic.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.